Hi everyone and welcome to this video. I'm Glenn and this is episode 7 of the Oathsworn painting series. In this episode I'm painting the Scar tribe. If you're new to miniature painting, I hope you find this video interesting and helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comment section below. Join me as we embark on the journey from simple untouched miniatures to this fully painted Scar tribe. Let's begin. First I remove all the mold lines by using a hobby knife or file. Next I wash and clean the models in soapy water, then rinse them in clean water and let them dry. Then I prime the models with Chaos Black primer. Next I used an airbrush to make a zenithal light effect by applying a white color from above. This can also be applied by using a can of white primer. If you would like to use speed paints for the base, a white base is required. I start the painting process by painting all the skin on the models. I use Bugman's Glow as the base coat. Next I begin layering the skin by using a mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone. It's a 1:1 ratio. In this tutorial I will show the process of each miniature one at a time. As the Berserkers are quite similar, I will only showcase one of them. I will demonstrate the entire process of the Shaman model first, followed by the Berserker, then the Bone Maiden and lastly the Pack Leader. However, I will be skipping some parts such as the leather and bone components, as they are a recurring theme on the models. Instead, I'll be focusing on the unique and important aspects for each miniature going forward. I continue the layering with pure Cadian Flesh Tone, moving the layering slightly towards the raised and most exposed areas of the model. Keep in mind, for each layer I apply going forward, I move that layer even more towards the raised and exposed area of the model. The next layer is a 1:1 ratio of Cadian flesh tone mixed with Kislev flesh. This layer is pure Kislev flesh. The next layer is a 1:1 ratio of Kislev flesh mixed with pale flesh. And lastly, small highlights on the skin with pure pale flesh. The skin is done and I continue on the fabrics on the model, starting with the cloth in between the legs, base coating the area with signal blue. I mix signal blue and bone white for further layering. I apply multiple layers, and for each layer applied, I add more bone white into the mix to make it lighter. At this stage you can see the blue is very light on the edges. I continue on the back, adding highlights to the edges and making scratches on the cape. To blend it all together, I apply a thin coat of signal blue mixed with glaze medium. For the next step, I dry brush the feathers using Oathsworn grey. After the dry brushing, I use red, purple and blue speed paints. I mix red and purple to create a slightly different tone of purple and apply this to the feathers. The mix consists of approximately 3 parts red and 7 parts purple. I also add blue in random spots to create some variation on the feathers. The speed paints are dry and I apply Kaldor Sky and Genestealer Purple in somewhat random pattern on the feathers. I use a more narrow brush on the chest. I follow up with some layering on the feathers, as I think they turned out a bit too dark. I use the same colors, Kalar Sky and Genestealer Purple. I mix Bone White into these two colors for the layering. This step is also done in somewhat random pattern. As the last step on the feathers, I dry brush with Bone White. I cover the cloth on the sides with black. I apply the first layer with Dark Reaper. The next layer is Dark Reaper mixed with medium gunship grey. The third layer is pure medium gunship grey. As the final highlight, I mix medium gunship grey with Bone White. To smooth out the transitions, I cover the cloth in a thin coat of Dark Reaper. I move on to painting the skulls and bones, starting with steel lead-in drab as the base coat. After the base coat was applied, I painted the straps on the stomach as I painted the cloth on the sides. I continue on the skulls and bone parts on the model and use tones of Steel Legion Drab and Bone White. At this stage I use pure Bone White. As the final highlight I use Oathsworn Grey. I basecoat the pounds, the straps on the arms and the straps on the stick with a black color. And for further layers and highlights I use the same process as on the cloth on the sides of the legs. There were also a few bone bits to paint. I used charred brown to base coat the leather parts on the legs and feet, and also the belt, the cords holding the skulls, and the dagger. And for further layers and highlights I use tones of charred brown, scrag brown and Yukaro orange. For the few metal parts I used chainmail silver for the base coat and steel for highlights. I painted the eyes with a mix of Oathsworn Grey and Fenrisian Grey for a light grey color. Nasibu is done for now. I'll get to the base later. Let's move on to the next suspect. The next model is one of the Berserkers. I base coat all the skin with Bogman's Glow. The skin is painted similar to the Shaman. So for this model, when painting the skin, I will only focus on the chest part of the model. Next I use a 1:1 ratio of Bogman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone, and begin to focus on the most exposed and raised areas on the chest. I make sure to have a shade underneath each muscle. I apply a layer using pure Cadian Flesh Tone. I move the layering slightly upwards and don't add too much at the lower parts of each muscle. The next layer is a 1:1 ratio of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh. The layer is moved even further upwards, focusing more on the upper parts of each muscle. I aim to have a shade underneath each muscle, but I connect them horizontally by painting the line from the upper chest to the stomach. As the light is coming from above, I believe this should be lit up. I follow up with another layer of pure Kislev Flesh, moving the layer more towards the light source. This layer is a 1:1 ratio of Kislev Flesh and Pale Flesh, and you guessed it, I move this layer more towards the light source. And the last layer, pure Pale Flesh, applied as the last highlight. I apply black on the cloth on the boots and in between the leather straps on the arms. Next, I base coat the leather parts by using charred brown. For further layering, highlights and details like scratches, I use tones of scrag brown and Yucaro orange. Lastly, I thinned down charred brown and apply a coat to the leather parts to blend out the colors. I painted the 3 leather pieces between the legs similar to what I just did, and base coated the leather around the waist with charred brown. I'll get back to that later. For the fur around the armguards, the belts and the boots, I used the same colors as I painted the bone parts, starting with a base coat of steel legion drab. I highlight the fur with bone white. And the last highlight with Oathsworn grey, making it lighter compared to the bone parts. I cover the belt and the cloth on the boots with black. And then I apply Dark Reaper. I thin down some black and apply this to the areas. The leather around the waist was coated with charred brown. Now I apply a coat of Agrax Earthshade. I mix charred brown and bone white and make textures in a random pattern. I follow up with a black color. Next I use a slightly lighter tone of charred brown and bone white, focusing on the edges using stippling. I thin down charred brown and apply this to the whole area. I paint the small stitches on the leather using scrag brown. I mix black and medium gunship grey to base coat the hair. Next I layer the hair with pure medium gunship grey. I thin down some black and apply a coat to the hair to shade and define the hair. I use a mix of medium gunship grey and Oathsworn grey to highlight the hair. I apply a thin coat of black again. I use a lighter tone of medium gunship grey mixed with Oathsworn grey as the last highlight. I base coat the rest of the untouched parts with chainmail silver, which should be the chain, the hook, armguards, the sword, the boots, the knee pads, the beard coin, the helmet, the shoulder thing, the back thing, the ring thing, buckle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you're done. Almost. Our body dodge is done for now. You should be able to replicate this process to his sidekick, Dylan. I'll get back to the base and the metal parts later. This model is the Bone Maiden. I painted her skin just like the others, starting with a base coat using Bugman's Glow. For the next steps painting the skin, I used the same colors as previously. I start painting the eyes by applying Oathsworn grey to the eye sockets. Next I use black to paint the pupils, adding them slightly to her left side. I use a small brush for this step. Once the pupils are applied, I clean up using the skin tones to refine and narrow the eye sockets. I will add war paints to her face in a later step. I apply beastie brown on the wood parts of the spear. Much of the Bone Maiden is already painted, following the same paint scheme used on the two previous models. You can find the chapters in the timeline or in the description to locate the specific parts and see how I painted them. I will cover the more specific parts on this model, like the spear, the trousers, the shirt and the hair. I paint wood grains on the shaft, first with charred brown. Next, I use bone white. I follow up with a thinned down charred brown. I paint the hair using Fire Giant Orange speed paint. The speed paint is dry and I highlight with Ducaro orange, focusing on the most raised and exposed areas. I use blood red speed paint to shade the lower and less exposed parts of the hair. The speed paint is dry and I continue highlighting the edges of the hair. I use tones of Ducaro orange and white, and gradually add more whites into the mix as I work towards the very edges. I don't use pure whites in this step.
Now let's move on to the trousers and the shirt. I apply a mix of Ducaro Orange and Lauren Forest as a base coat. For further layering, I add more Ducaro Orange into the mix. And for the final highlights, I add Tau Light Ochre into the mix of Ducaro Orange and Lauren Forest. I use purple speed paints to apply war paints around the eyes. I also do a small cleanup using the skin tones. I follow up with blood red speed paints, applying more war paints to the face. The Bone Maiden is done for now, her weapon is looking sharp. We will dive into that part of the story in a later step, including the base. The last model is the pack leader. I painted his skin just like the others, starting with a base coat using Bogman's Glow. For the next steps painting the skin, I used the same colors as previously. You can follow and see the colors I use in the upper left corner.
For the pack leader's hair and beard, I use a mix of medium gunship grey and Oathsworn grey as a base coat. Much of the pack leader is already painted, following the same paint scheme used on the Shaman and the Berserker models. You can find the chapters in the timeline or in the description to locate the specific parts and see how I painted them. I will cover the more specific parts on this model, like the hair, the cape and the pelt. The pelt will be repainted in a later step, as I did not like how it turned out. I gradually add more Oathsworn grey into the mix for further layering. For the most part, when doing this, I use the side of the brush. This is pure Oathsworn grey. I also use this color to highlight the eyebrows. For the final highlights, I use pure white. I mix charred brown and medium gunship grey and use that mix as the base coat on the cape. For the first layer, I add bone white into the mix. And for each layer applied, I gradually add more bone white into the mix. This is the final layer and highlights.
I decided to repaint the pelt as I didn't like the appearance. I basecoat the pelt with Dark Reaper. I continue layering the pelt using a mix of Dark Reaper and Bone White. I add highlights to the bear's head and paint small thin lines, creating a fur effect. I dry brush the pelt using Oathsworn Grey. I follow up with a brush using the side of the brush to highlight the edges. For the eyes, I use Oathsworn Grey to paint the eye sockets. I use a black color to paint the pupil. I use the skin tones to refine and narrow down the eye socket. I complete the eyes and Bossman is nearly done. Now let's move on to the neat part, the weapons. The metal parts like the weapons, chains, boots and armor are base coated with chainmail silver. I will showcase the Berserker first and later the pack leader. My goal is to aim for the artwork so the weapons have a hint of purple. For the weapons I paint a random pattern with Hive Dweller purple, making the illusion of reflection. This technique is applied to both sides of the blade. For the chain and hook I just apply the purple speed paint all over these parts. The speed paint is dry and I apply a thin coat covering the whole blade to smooth out the transition from purple to silver. Next I use steel to highlight the edges of the blade and make contrast between purple and steel in this somewhat random pattern. I also highlight the edge on the middle of the blade.
I highlight the chain and the hook using steel. The same applies for the armguards. I just highlight with steel. And the same goes for the helmet. For the boots, I apply a coat of purple speed paint. Next I apply a light dry brush with chainmail silver. I follow up with steel, focusing on the edges. This makes great contrast between the purple and steel on the edges. It's a pretty easy process and the end result is great. Remember to paint the bone parts on the arm guards and the horns on the helmet. I repeated the same process on the pack leader, starting with purple speed paints on all the metal parts, followed up by chainmail silver and steel on the metal parts, just like the Berserker. The axe is too awesome to skip, so I will show the process for that one. It's painted similar to the Berserker's blade, starting with steel in a random pattern, creating the reflection. I also highlight the edges. I repeat the process on the other side of the blade. After applying steel, it looks something like this. I paint the bone parts on the eggs just like the other bone parts, using steel leading drab, bone white and Oathsworn grey. I apply a thin coat of purple speed paint to smooth out the transition from purple to steel. I use steel again to highlight the engravings on the eggs, and apply the last highlight on the blade and also the edges. To define the scars on the body parts on the Berserkers and the Pack Leader, I use Bugman's Glow, painting shades along the scars. Next I follow up with a mix of Bugman's Glow and Pale Flesh to highlight the scars. For the wounds on our body dodge, I use blood for the blood god. Let's move on to the bases. I use Sealord Yellow, Heathen Leather, Orc Skin, Highlord Blue and Gravelord Grey. These colors are applied to the base in a manner similar to what I have done in my previous videos. I create a random pattern while ensuring there is contrast between the colors. I can recommend watching episode 3 with the civilians. I show some examples in that video. You should be able to locate the chapter using the timeline or the description in the video. Next, I apply details and highlights to the bases using Bone White, Caliban Green, Uriel Yellow, Scrag Brown, Light Sea Blue and Warlord Purple. I use tones of Caliban Green and Uriel Yellow for the green areas, Scrag Brown and Bone White for the light or brown areas. Light Sea Blue and Warlord Purple are added to the base as details, creating fungus or mushrooms. I go 2 laps around each base rim with a black color. I apply a coat of matte varnish to all the models. I covered all the metal parts with a mix of 5 parts satin varnish and 1 part glaze medium. For the wounds on dodge, I covered the blood effect with gloss varnish for a wet and fresh appearance. For the absolute final step, I add some tufts to the base using super glue.
Accursed creatures stand at our gates, and the Painting Chronicles Brotherhood stands at the ready to face this evil. Join our cause by subscribing, and we shall triumph together. Pillar and Path Brothers. Also like and comment.